It started like a whisper in the sky, a thin crack of light stretching across the clouds. People thought it was a strange aurora or a meteor shower, but then the crack grew wider, glowing black instead of bright. Within hours, the skies over every major city turned dark as enormous ships appeared, shaped like jagged shadows, their surfaces rippling as if alive. They didn't roar or thunder like in the movies. They came silently, and that silence was more terrifying than any explosion. The world froze. Air traffic stopped, the internet crashed, and the streets were filled with people staring upward, phones trembling in their hands as they tried to record what no one could explain. Governments sent messages, warnings, and peace offers, but no one answered. For 3 days, the ship simply hung there, unmoving, watching, waiting. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Then one night, it began. A strange signal came through every screen and radio across the planet. Not a message, not a voice, but a scream. It was low at first, almost like a vibration inside people's chests, and then it grew louder until it felt like the air itself was crying out. Lights flickered, power grids exploded, and entire cities went dark. Planes fell from the sky, satellites went silent, and in the darkness the ships opened. Shadows poured out, not made of flesh or metal, but of something worse. Something that seemed to crawl straight into people's minds. They didn't attack with weapons. They didn't need to. They fed on fear. At first, no one understood what was happening. People saw strange movements at the edge of their vision, heard whispers calling their names, felt cold hands brushing against their skin. Some collapsed, screaming about things that weren't there. The more frightened people became, the stronger the creatures grew. Cities fell not because of fire or bombs, but because people couldn't stop the terror. Soldiers dropped their weapons, unable to fight what they couldn't see. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight as the shadows devoured every ounce of fear they could find. The creatures didn't leave marks or wounds. They left emptiness. They drained emotions, leaving behind hollow eyes and broken minds. The world that once prided itself on technology and power now found itself helpless against something ancient, something that understood the one truth about humanity, that fear is the oldest part of our soul. For the first time in history, humanity realized that this enemy couldn't be destroyed with missiles or machines. It wasn't just a war for survival. It was a war for courage. In the quiet that followed each attack, people huddled together in the dark, whispering prayers, clutching loved ones, waiting for daylight that never came. The sun was still there, hidden behind the ships, behind the darkness that refused to lift. And as the world trembled under its own fear, no one yet knew that this was only the beginning of the day humanity's demons would fight back. The world fell apart faster than anyone could have imagined. Within hours of the ship's opening, chaos spread from one continent to another like wildfire. What had begun as confusion turned into complete panic. People ran through the streets searching for safety that didn't exist. Sirens wailed in the distance, lights flickered across empty cities, and screams echoed in the dark. The creatures that came from the ships weren't like anything humanity had ever seen. They weren't made of metal or flesh, but of something darker. They had no clear shape, only shifting shadows that crawled across walls and floors, slipping through cracks and corners as if gravity meant nothing. And wherever they went, fear followed. At first, the military tried to fight back. Tanks rolled through the streets, fighter jets soared above cities, and missiles lit up the sky. But nothing worked. Bullets went straight through the creatures like smoke. Explosions only made them spread faster like a cloud feeding on chaos. Soldiers who tried to stand their ground ended up screaming before they vanished into the dark. It wasn't their bodies the creatures wanted, it was their fear. The more humanity panicked, the stronger the invaders became. Every cry, every tear, every heartbeat filled with terror was like energy to them. The more people broke down, the more powerful the creatures grew. And soon, it wasn't just cities collapsing. It was hope itself. In the middle of this destruction, small groups of people began to hide wherever they could. In basements, subway tunnels, broken hospitals, anywhere the shadows seemed thinner. But even underground, the fear still found them. People began to realize that these creatures didn't need to see you to reach you. They could feel you. They fed on every pulse of fear like sharks scenting blood in the water. The more you thought about them, the closer they came. Humanity was trapped not just by the aliens, but by its own emotions. The greatest weapon these creatures had wasn't strength. It was the human heart itself. But then, deep in one of the ruined cities, something changed. A small group of survivors, soldiers, scientists, and ordinary people began to notice a strange pattern. The creatures didn't attack everyone with the same strength. There were moments when they hesitated, almost weak, whenever someone faced them without fear. One night, as the creatures passed through a shattered subway, a woman who had lost everything just sat still. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She only looked at them with empty eyes. The shadows paused, flickered, and then moved away. It wasn't power that drove them off. It was calm. That moment planted a seed of realization among the survivors. The creatures were not gods. They were addicts, addicted to fear, pain, and despair. And addiction could be controlled. Maybe the key to fighting back wasn't in guns or bombs, but in the human spirit itself. Deep beneath the ruined streets, among flickering lights and fading hope, the first spark of resistance began. Not of war, but of understanding. Humanity, for the first time since the sky had darkened, began to wonder, what would happen if they stopped being afraid? In the ruins of what was once a great city, a small group of survivors hid beneath a crumbling building. The streets above were nothing but silence and smoke, the air thick with the memory of screams that had faded days ago. Among the survivors was a woman who seemed different from the rest. Her name was Captain Mara Ellis, though no one called her by rank anymore. Before the invasion, she had been a psychologist, someone who studied fear, who helped others find calm in chaos. Now she was just another soldier in a war that humanity didn't understand. She had lost everything, her home, her family, and the quiet life she once had. For a long time, she believed she had nothing left to fight for. But watching people around her fall apart, trembling and crying in the dark, something inside her refused to break. One night, while she and her group sat in the flickering light of a dying fire, she noticed something strange. The creatures that haunted the streets hadn't attacked that night. In fact, they seemed to pass over their hiding place entirely. Everyone was too tired, too numb to be afraid anymore. For the first time, the air felt still. The next day, when one of the survivors began to panic, whispering that the monsters were coming, a shadow appeared almost immediately, creeping down the street like living smoke. The group froze, but Mara stepped forward. She didn't run, didn't scream. She looked at the thing and forced herself to breathe slowly, her heart pounding, but her body steady. The shadow quivered as if uncertain, and then it vanished. That moment changed everything for her. She began testing her theory, quietly observing the connection between emotion and the creatures. Each time someone lost control, the monsters came closer. But when they stayed calm, the darkness hesitated. "They feed on fear," she whispered to herself one night. "Then we'll starve them." Those words spread through the small group like fire in the cold. The next time they ventured out for supplies, they moved slowly, keeping their hearts steady and their minds clear. The creatures hovered nearby but never attacked. The survivors began to believe. Mara realized that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a war for the human spirit. If fear gave the enemy strength, then courage could take it away. She started teaching her group breathing techniques, ways to focus their thoughts, ways to control panic when the shadows came near. They meditated together, told stories of the world before the invasion, and held hands in silence when the air grew cold. Slowly, the fear that had once ruled them began to fade. And for the first time since the ships arrived, the monsters grew weaker. The darkness outside their shelter seemed thinner, less alive. Mara looked out through the cracks in the wall, at the faint light breaking through the clouds, and she felt something she hadn't in months: hope. They couldn't win with guns or bombs. But maybe, just maybe, they could win with what made them human. Beneath the shattered streets of London, in a maze of tunnels that had once been part of the city's old underground system, humanity's last hope began to take shape. Captain Mara Ellis had turned those cold, damp tunnels into a base, not a military stronghold, but something far more fragile, a lab built on desperation and belief. Around her were soldiers who had lost their weapons, scientists who had lost their labs, and civilians who had lost their homes. Yet somehow, every one of them carried a spark of determination in their eyes. They were broken, but they weren't finished. Mara had a theory, one so strange that many called it madness. But madness was all they had left. If fear made the invaders stronger, then maybe another emotion could make them weaker. Not anger, not hate, but hope. Working with what little equipment they could salvage, they built something called the emotion amplifier, a strange mix of wires, old military tech, and neural scanners scavenged from hospitals. The idea was simple, but dangerous. To project human emotion like energy, a signal that could reach the creatures on a level no weapon could. But to do that, they needed people willing to face their deepest pain, to channel it into something powerful. Volunteers stepped forward, ordinary men and women who had already lost everything. They sat in metal chairs, their heads wired to machines, as the scientists tried to turn feelings into frequencies. At first, all they could produce was chaos. Fear, grief, and anger mixed in the air. And each time it happened, shadows crept closer to their base. Days turned into weeks. The experiments took a toll. Some lost consciousness, others lost their minds. Mara stayed with them through every test, whispering encouragement even when the air trembled with unseen danger. It was during one of those endless nights that something finally shifted. A child had slipped into the base, a 12-year-old girl rescued from the streets above. She had seen her parents taken by the creatures, yet she wasn't afraid anymore. When the others begged her to rest, she simply looked at Mara and said, "Let me try." Against every protocol, Mara agreed. They connected her to the amplifier. The machine hummed, lights flickering weakly in the darkness. Then, from the far end of the tunnel, one of the shadow creatures appeared, drawn by the experiment's energy. The soldiers raised their weapons, but Mara stopped them. The girl stood slowly, unshaken, and looked at the creature with calm, steady eyes. "You can't scare me anymore," she said softly. The creature froze, its form twisting violently. A scream ripped through the tunnel, not from the girl, but from the alien. It writhed, shuddered, and then turned to dust, leaving only silence. No one spoke for several seconds. Then, for the first time since the invasion began, people began to cry, not from fear, but from hope. Mara realized then that humanity's greatest weapon had never been its machines or its armies. It was its heart. That night, the survivors didn't sleep. They knew what they had just seen wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something that could turn the tide. The news spread like wildfire through the broken world. Humanity had found something that could fight the darkness. It wasn't a weapon of steel or fire, but something far more powerful and ancient. It was courage. Hope had become humanity's new weapon, and it spread faster than fear ever had. The story of the little girl who made a monster turn to ash reached every surviving radio, every whispered campfire conversation, every hidden bunker. People began to realize that maybe they weren't helpless after all. Maybe they didn't need to hide anymore. The first time someone faced a creature without fear, it was an accident. The second time, it was a choice. By the third, it became a movement. Soldiers who once trembled behind barricades now marched into the streets singing. Their voices echoed through the ruins, shaky at first, but growing stronger with every step. Civilians followed their example. Some painted bright colors on their faces. Others danced in the open while the shadows circled around them. When the creatures came close, expecting terror, they found laughter instead. And that laughter burned like sunlight. Every time a person stood tall, a creature faltered. Every time someone smiled through the fear, the monsters grew weaker. Humanity began to learn something the invaders had never faced before, that courage could be contagious. Across the world, strange scenes unfolded. In the frozen cities of the north, people built fires and sang songs as the black skies trembled above them. In the deserts, survivors painted huge symbols of hope across the sand, words that glowed faintly when the creatures approached. And in the ruins of old skyscrapers, soldiers climbed to the rooftops and waved bright flags, their silhouettes standing firm against the shadowed sky. They weren't hiding anymore. They were daring the darkness to come. The aliens couldn't understand it. In every world they had conquered before, fear had broken the people first. But humans were different. They didn't just resist. They adapted. What should have been weakness, emotion, became strength. They used fear not as a chain, but as a reminder of what they were fighting for. For the first time, the invaders hesitated. Their movements became slower, uncertain. They watched from their black ships as humans laughed and lived in defiance of terror itself. Mara's message, "Starve them of fear," had become humanity's war cry. From underground shelters to mountaintop camps, the phrase echoed like a heartbeat. The more people believed, the less power the creatures had. The skies began to clear, the air grew lighter, and even the shadows seemed to shrink back. Something impossible was happening. The hunters were becoming the hunted. For the first time since the invasion began, the darkness retreated. The demons of fear who had once feasted on human despair began to feel something new, something they had never known before. They began to feel fear themselves. Humanity had turned the tide, not with rage or hatred, but with the one thing no alien could understand, the unbreakable spirit of the human heart. The world that once lay silent in darkness was coming alive again. What started as whispers of courage had now turned into a roar of unity. Humanity had learned how to turn its emotions into strength, not through rage, but through hope, love, and defiance. Scientists, soldiers, and civilians worked side by side, building huge amplifiers out of salvaged technology. These machines were designed not to destroy, but to broadcast emotion itself, a living signal that pulsed with the collective heartbeat of humankind. Around them, cities that had been lost to fear began to rise again. Streets once empty were filled with light, laughter, and music. The air still trembled with the memory of horror, but now it carried something stronger: belief. Mara and her team worked day and night to link the amplifiers together, creating a network that connected every remaining settlement across the world. When they activated the first one, a soft wave of warmth spread through the air. People said they could feel it, a calm that wrapped around their hearts and reminded them that they were still alive. That calm grew stronger as more amplifiers came online. The creatures tried to stop them, appearing in swarms of black mist and twisted shadows, but each time they came near, they weakened. Hope was poison to them. Courage was fire. Then came the final assault. The aliens unleashed their greatest wave, colossal forms that blotted out the stars, creatures born of pure rage and terror. They roared across the skies, their screams echoing through the air, shaking the ground as cities trembled once more. But this time humanity didn't hide. Across every screen, every speaker, and every channel, a single global broadcast began. The image showed people from all nations standing hand in hand, soldiers, children, mothers, fathers, all united. And then, in one voice that carried across the entire planet, they shouted, "We are not afraid!" The sound hit the air like a pulse. The amplifiers glowed brighter, sending waves of emotion up into the sky. The creatures froze mid-flight, twisting in agony as the energy surrounded them. Their black forms cracked, light spilling out like fire breaking through darkness. All across the world, they began to fall, not because of bombs, but because of something far stronger. Humanity had turned its pain into power, its sorrow into strength. The skies, once covered in black, began to clear. One by one, the massive ships flickered, then burned away like dying stars. People looked up and saw sunlight breaking through for the first time in what felt like forever. The world was still scarred, still broken, but it was alive. And as the last echo of the alien scream faded, the light returned completely. Humanity had not just survived, it had reminded the universe what it meant to be unbreakable. When the final alien fell and the last ship dissolved into the sky, the world grew quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from fear, but the kind that follows victory. For a moment, no one spoke. No one celebrated. They simply stood under the sunlight, blinking as if seeing it for the first time. The black clouds that had once swallowed the earth were gone, leaving behind a pale blue sky filled with smoke, dust, and hope. Half the world lay in ruins, cities flattened, oceans polluted, forests burned, but what remained was something stronger than walls, stronger than any weapon. Humanity had survived not because it was the most powerful, but because it had learned what true strength meant. In the days that followed, people came out from bunkers and shelters, stepping into streets filled with the ghosts of what once was. But instead of breaking down, they began to rebuild, not for themselves, but for each other. There were no borders anymore, no sides or flags. The old arguments that had divided nations seemed meaningless now. In their place stood something new: unity. Soldiers shared food with strangers, engineers from one continent worked with farmers from another, and scientists taught children how to grow plants in the dust. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting to live better. Captain Mara became a quiet symbol of what people had endured. She didn't see herself as a hero, just another survivor who refused to give up. Reporters and world leaders tried to honor her, offering medals and titles, but she refused them all. When someone asked her why, she simply said, "We didn't win because we were fearless. We won because we chose to fight our fear." Her words spread across the world like a new anthem, reminding everyone that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing tall even when you were. As the rebuilding continued, stories from the war began to surface. Stories of people who had stood unarmed before the monsters, who had sung instead of screamed, who had protected others even when they could have run. Those stories became lessons for the next generation. Schools taught them not as tales of war, but as reminders of what it means to be human, to care, to endure, to hope. And though the invaders were gone, their legacy remained. They had come to feed on humanity's fear but ended up forcing people to face it. In trying to destroy them, the aliens had unknowingly given humans their greatest gift, the strength to confront their own demons. In every rebuilt city and every small act of kindness, that lesson lived on. The world was scarred, but it was also reborn. Humanity had not only survived the darkness, it had learned to shine through it. Years passed, and the memory of the invasion turned from pain into legend. The world that once trembled in darkness was now filled with light, rebuilt not just by hands but by hearts. Children were born who never knew fear the way their parents had. They only knew the stories. In classrooms, teachers spoke of the day the demons fell, the day humanity stopped running and started believing. It wasn't taught as a tale of war, but as a lesson about what it meant to be truly human. Across every nation, monuments stood, not for generals or soldiers, but for the ordinary people who faced the unknown with courage. The world was no longer divided by flags or borders. It was united by one shared truth, that fear may shake humanity, but it can never break it. Technology evolved in ways no one had imagined. The amplifiers that once projected courage on the battlefield were turned into devices that healed minds and hearts. Scientists discovered how emotions could influence energy, how calm and compassion could restore balance in both humans and the planet itself. Hospitals used them to ease pain, schools used them to teach focus, and cities powered entire systems through collective emotional harmony. Humanity had learned to harness not machines of destruction, but machines of feeling. And in this new era, peace didn't come from control. It came from understanding. But even as the world thrived, the scars of the past remained. Some ruins were left untouched as reminders, dark towers of twisted metal standing like silent guardians of memory. At night, people still lit candles beneath them, not in mourning, but in gratitude. They remembered those who had faced the impossible so that others could live without fear. Artists painted murals of glowing light defeating shadows, and musicians wrote songs that began softly with despair and ended in hope. Every creation carried a single message: that courage is contagious, and kindness is stronger than terror. Far beyond Earth, humanity began to explore the stars again. New ships, peaceful and shining, traveled across galaxies once ruled by the invaders. In the cold emptiness of space, explorers found remains of the alien empire, shattered ships, silent planets, and empty cities where even echoes had faded. What had once been symbols of power were now nothing but dust, drifting among the stars. The universe had moved on, but humanity carried the lesson forever. One evening, in a quiet home overlooking a lake, An old woman sat by the window, watching the stars. It was Mara. Her hair had turned white, her hands frail, but her eyes still burned with the same strength they always had. As she looked up at the endless sky, she smiled softly and whispered, "They thought fear made us weak. They never understood that's what made us human." The stars seemed to shimmer brighter, as if the universe itself was listening, honoring the story of a species that turned its greatest fear into its greatest strength.